5 years ago, I flew to South Africa to embark on a conservation research internship. See, I've always felt most at peace out in nature, so the idea of spending my days in nature reserves supporting wildlife conservation was something that I expected to be uplifting and inspiring. I learned early on that it wasn't so simple. Toward the end of my first week in the country, we were surveying a reserve which had a line of train tracks running through it. This was a legacy of a colonial-era mining project right near the reserve that was still active when I was in the country. As we were going to exit the reserve, I caught a glimpse of an elephant that had just been struck by that train. She was slumped over the train tracks, laying in a pool of dried blood, with her skull split open from the impact. Imagine that scene for a moment. If you see a scene as gruesome as that, you try to make some sense of it. You try to understand how an elephant in a nature reserve can be struck dead by a train. This moment led to 5 years of ongoing research into South Africa's conservation system. This research has come to encompass over 30 interviews with experts from around the globe and local stakeholders alike. And early on in this research process, I discovered that the tragic death of this elephant was not a one-off circumstance. It was a symptom of a larger conservation system that's deeply entangled with economic injustice, global crime, and the legacy of apartheid. And discovering this led me to uncover the violent reality of the rhino poaching crisis in South Africa today. My name is Brecker Ferguson, and I'm here to share with you how living in the rhino poaching capital of the world made me completely rethink conservation and my place in a post-colonial society. I was living in South Africa's greater Kruger area, which sits on the borders with Zimbabwe and Mozambique. Kruger National Park, which is about the size of the country of El Salvador, or just a bit smaller than the state of Massachusetts, is home to the world's largest single population of rhinoceros. For that reason, Kruger has become a hotspot for poaching activity, which involves the illegal killing of rhinos for their horns, which are then trafficked and sold overseas to foreign consumers. I saw firsthand the effects of this violent practice of rhino poaching. There was a reserve close to where I lived, and at this reserve, we frequently encountered this pair of rhinos pictured behind me. The one in front, we had named her Olivia, and she had a pretty tragic backstory. When Olivia was just a calf, her mother was killed by poachers, who cut off the animal's horn and left it to die overnight. Olivia was found the next morning crying beside her mother's lifeless body. Conservationists took Olivia in, rehabilitated her, and were able to successfully return her to the wild. However, such successful rehabilitation is rare in rhino conservation. Based on interviews that I held with subject experts, they suggested that less than 20% of orphaned rhino calves are able to return to the wild. This is because many of them aren't found in time. They'll refuse to leave their mother's body, and they'll die of starvation or dehydration before they can be found. Those that are found are often so debilitated from the trauma of losing their mothers that they permanently require human care to survive. And while at first Olivia's return to the wild seemed to be a rare success story in rhino conservation, a year after I returned to the United States, I learned that Olivia herself was also poached. I encountered tragic stories like Olivia's at every reserve I went to. Rhino populations in Kruger have decreased by 60% over the past decade. In response, reserves have adopted a militaristic approach to conservation. They've employed armed anti-poaching units, which are ordered to shoot on sight any unidentified individuals who are seen in the reserve after dark. Entering into these reserves felt like going through a military checkpoint, and we were required to have certain levels of security clearance just to collect data on these animals, out of fear that one of us could secretly be affiliated with one of these poaching syndicates. And so as I came to witness this warlike state of conservation in South Africa, I asked myself, why would someone risk their lives just to engage in such a cruel and violent act of rhino poaching? As I researched more, I realized that understanding poaching goes beyond the act itself. It's about understanding the circumstances that drive a person to kill a rhino. The people living around Kruger and the nature reserves are the descendants of those who were displaced 100 years ago when the park was first created. And apartheid left generations in poverty, which still persists today. When I was in the country, the unemployment rate in South Africa was 29%. Today, it stands at about 33%, meaning that 1 in 3 people looking for a job are unable to find one. And that's a national average, not even taking into account the large racial and socioeconomic disparities that still exist in South Africa today. I saw firsthand how this results in exceptionally high rates of poverty just outside of these nature reserves. So when large multinational crime syndicates enter into South Africa looking for suppliers of rhino horn, the people living near these reserves are being offered more money than they've ever seen in their lives. As a whole, the illegal wildlife trade is valued at somewhere between $7 to $23 billion in revenue annually, and rhino horn makes up a significant portion of that. When crushed into a powder, rhino horn can nearly double the price of cocaine and even rival the price of gold in places like China and Vietnam, where it's valued as a status symbol and as an ingredient in traditional medicinal practices. Even just the fraction of that value that makes it back to the actual poachers, maybe 10,000 US dollars for a single kill, can translate into a down payment on a new home, schooling for one's children, or medical care. For the people living near these reserves, it's not that poaching is necessarily the only income opportunity. However, it is by far the most profitable opportunity for one to provide a better life for themselves, their families, and their communities. But it's not easy money. Poachers who are caught can face severe fines, imprisonment, or even death from confrontations with anti-poaching units. It's a life or death gamble, but if successful, it leaves these poachers with more money than they ever could have earned through traditional labor. For poachers, it's not a choice between right and wrong. It's a choice between poverty and opportunity. This forces us to reconsider how we talk about poachers. Are they truly evil, as they're often portrayed, or are they rational economic actors in a broken system? If that system offers no better alternatives to poaching to earn a living, can we expect any different of an outcome? Yes, we can and should have conversations about accountability and the just prosecution of poachers. But I argue that we're not solving the root cause of the poaching crisis if we don't discuss how our Western approach to conservation is resulting in costly, violent, and ultimately unsustainable outcomes. The conservation system in South Africa is a relic of the colonial era. Parks like Kruger were created 100 years ago to separate the people from the land and to herald wilderness as something to be preserved for the benefit of the colonial elite. This has evolved into the modern ecotourism industry we're familiar with today, which still primarily serves South Africa's white population, its wealthy upper class, and foreigners like myself. And this exclusionary approach to conservation leaves many South Africans feeling apathetic toward wildlife, and some even resentful of conservation efforts. It's for this reason that poaching can be seen not only as an economic action, but as a way to reclaim power in this unjust system. And it's a system that relies heavily on foreign funding in order to survive. Most reserves get the majority of their revenue through luxury safari tours, trophy hunting, or, as in my case, conservation research. And while this does provide crucial revenue for these reserves to be able to survive, it also ties the survival of South African wildlife to the whims of the global tourism economy, which, as COVID-19 showed, is a precarious strategy for conservation. Furthermore, this model of conservation prioritizes the interests of foreigners like myself over those who have reserves literally in their backyards. As I came to understand this system of conservation, I also questioned my place within it. On the one hand, as a conservationist, I was doing important work to support the interests of the wildlife. Without conservationists like myself and the anti-poaching units, the rhinos would be all but extinct, the ecosystems would be on the path for collapse, and the natural heritage of South Africa and the world would be lost forever. There were moments in South Africa when I was brought to tears by seeing the beauty of a herd of elephants parading through the bush, or seeing a lion nap beneath the warm sun. And it reaffirmed my belief that these animals' lives hold intrinsic value. And it reaffirmed my belief also that any effort to protect the populations of these animals is important and necessary. However, on the other hand, by supporting this model of conservation, I was also supporting the continuation of the legacy of apartheid, and in doing so, was complacent. While my intentions were certainly noble, my actions followed a wider trend of well-meaning Western conservationists prioritizing African wildlife over African people. And so, as I reflected on this, I realized that I was caught in a catch-22 between promoting the interests of the wildlife and supporting the needs of the people. Ultimately, if a system isn't serving the needs of both the people and the animals, can we truly consider it sustainable? I think that side of the conversation is lacking within conservation. So I aim to reframe the discussion around conservation to include 3 key points. First, that we should be moving toward decreasing reliance on foreign funding and participation in order for wildlife to thrive by unlocking the flow of domestic capital in whatever ways we can. Second, by increasing the opportunities for local participation in wildlife conservation. So that way people living near the reserves can participate in and benefit from the conservation system. And third, fully integrate stakeholder communities into the decision-making process within conservation management, regardless of how much money they have. My biggest takeaway from my research and my experience was this: if a system is unsustainable for one stakeholder, the entire system itself is unsustainable. Intuitively, when we say the word conservation, it's implied that it's sustainable. However, as we see in South Africa and so many other parts of the world, when we view nature reserves as a closed system, we're neglecting the needs and influences of the human stakeholders that, in reality, do act upon that system. We can learn a lot by looking past these black and white judgments of insanely complex topics. At face value, conservation as an aspiration is a noble pursuit, but that doesn't mean that all conservation systems are inherently good or equitable. And poaching is a violent and cruel act, but that doesn't mean that poachers are evil or misguided people. By waving aside our moral biases, we can come to view these systems in a more pragmatic, objective light. And in doing so, we can better work toward a solution that will ultimately provide greater sustainability for the wildlife and the people alike. Thank you.